Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining the BuzzStream webinar today. My name is Vince Nero. I'm the Director of Content Marketing here at BuzzStream. And today I'm joined by Alex Fisk and Chloe Osunsami, both from Era. And we're going to be talking about how AI-generated summaries are impacting your PR outreach. Now, this is kind of piggybacking off of a big study that we did with the Era team. And yeah, I'm excited to hear what they have to say. We kind of fleshed this out, giving some more kind of actionable takeaways, and but also going to kind of go through what the study found, because I do think something that is very underreported at this point. Like, I feel like it's not on a lot of people's radar, but I think it's hugely important. It's going to become a lot more important as this stuff continues to roll out on all of the platforms, and AI gets integrated throughout everything that we do. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Chloe and Alex, and we're going to have some points throughout where we have discussion. So if you have any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, but I'll also be asking some questions, and then we'll also open it up for Q&A at the end. And a reminder, sorry, before we fully hand it over, is everybody that's going to be part of this webinar is also going to get free credits to List IQ if you'd like to check it out. It's our media list building tool that syncs right up with Google News, and you can build media lists that way. I think you'll see a little sneak peek of it in action within this presentation. So for real this time, handing it over to Chloe and Alex.
Thanks, Vin. So as Vince mentioned, today we're going to go through 4 key areas. I'm going to stop throughout. First, we're going to talk about why AI-generated summaries matter right now. Then we'll jump into the findings before we talk about what it means for pitch emails, and then go through a Q&A. So to jump straight into it, initially some findings from the Muckrack State of Journalism 2026 highlighted that AI adoption among journalists has climbed to 82%. So very high. ChatGPT and Gemini lead the way, maybe unsurprisingly, but they're using it for all sorts of things, from brainstorming and research and fact checking through to SEO optimization. And it's probably quite unsurprising because they are very busy, as we all know. So there's some stats here from both the Muckrack report, but also the Cision State of Media report, highlighting just how busy they are. About 29% of journalists receive between 6 and 10 PR pitches a day. That's up from last year. And on top of that, an additional 17% receive over 3 times that, daily or weekly. Then you've got the fact that almost half say resource constraints are one of the biggest challenges currently, and 47% of journalists describe their work as exhausting. It's a little bit sad, really, but it just shows the extent to which they are really busy in their roles. And so we do expect that journalists are experimenting and trying new things to help with all areas of their role, but obviously one of the key areas which is time consuming is reviewing inboxes. So the main providers here, we think they're probably using them across all of them because they all have AI summaries that are pretty quick to click. Go on, Alex. Thank you. But with that in mind as well, accuracy and misinformation are currently also big concerns and big frustrations for journalists. So about half cite them as being a top challenge, and also inaccurate information as the biggest frustration. So that's why we believe it matters right now. We know it's still in the early days and everything is still progressing at 100 miles an hour, so it is changing. But because of the fact that journalists are really busy, we know they're already using AI, we are making the assumption that they are probably experimenting with ways to review their inboxes. And that's where we're going to do our first quick pause to open up if anyone has any questions.
I did have one overall question with this study in general, I guess, is, or when we're thinking about the ways that AI is being integrated, do you think that there's, or have you seen, or felt as practitioners of this, reply rates are going down? Do you hear, because I've heard anecdotally, more things are getting packed into AI spam blockers, where it's journalists are creating these tools that kind of look for these AI signals. This is separate from kind of the study itself, but I feel like that's almost the first layer of defense sometimes, is whether or not they're just getting rejected or they mark them as unread or archived immediately. I mean, have you felt that or heard anything like that?
Alex, feel free to add. There was one of the stats from one of the reports said that it's not a huge percentage, but 13% are using AI tools built specifically for their newsroom. So I wouldn't be surprised if they had specific AI checkers to rule things out already. And obviously that's not very high, but I would expect that to grow.
Yeah.
Alex, have you seen anything in open rates, things like that?
I would definitely say there's been a reduction in journalists replying directly, and I think that just correlates with the fact that they're just getting 1.5, 2 times as many pitches like a day. That I think it kind of gets to the point where if a journalist actually replies to you, then it really is quite an amazing feeling, because that used to happen a lot more regularly than it does now.
Even to say like it wasn't a good fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really one thing I do want to try and find out from a journalist is whether they are building some sort of software that if they receive, say, a pitch, or there's been a lot of news obviously around expert comments being AI drafted, whether they have something internally built that as soon as an email gets sent to them, if they can just see that's 100% written AI, it just goes straight into a bin. I do wonder if that's going to be something that they will eventually have, because it will filter through real stories and real people for comments versus like the AI side of stuff. So I think that'd be very interesting to see if that comes about soon.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of what I was talking about. Like, I do think those exist because I've seen people talk about them. One of our podcast guests, Carly Martinetti, I think it was Carly, shared it was like a journalist ChatGPT prompt that they had built, and you could see kind of all the things it looked for, keywords like delved or, overuse of whatever, like certain phrases and that stuff. And I know we'll kind of get into some of that potentially in this, but I even just recently asked in anticipation of this webinar, I asked this on Reddit to see what people said. I didn't really get there's no programs out there yet that do that. And people did. It wasn't like overwhelmingly like, yes, I have this built, but as I was expecting, but I'm sure it's out there. It's just probably, like you said, slow to adopt, but we'll get there.
It was really interesting as well. I actually saw it this morning that we had some coverage from MSN, but it actually had written on there that something like this article was AI curated. It actually put that on their article where it was indexed. It was just sourcing some information around a story, but it plain and clear basically said this was not written by a journalist. This was used AI to create. So I do wonder if there's also going to be a time and a place for a journalist to write an article and a built-in platform to kind of just curate that content and create an article itself. But it's very interesting to see that they were very upfront and honest on what it was, because normally MSN is obviously a syndicated site that just picks up from other publications. I'll see if I can dig it out of them this morning. But yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, definitely. But yeah, if you let's power on.
So that opens the question of how is AI summarizing the pitch emails, and is it actually showing the key aspects that you'd want it to represent the study or the expert that you're trying to sell into the media in the right way. So we underwent a study, and throughout March and April, we took a deep dive into a number of emails. So we used 106 email templates across 13 campaigns. So between roughly 4 to 11 templates per campaign, and those split out specific variables so that we could compare a first email to a change of a variable and make those fair comparisons. Each email was then sent to 2 recipients on each of the major platforms, so Google, Apple, and Microsoft, so we could see how the different AI assistants were summarizing the emails. And to start with, we had a number of research questions about lots of different variables and key email focuses, so different techniques and tactics that many people use when it comes to writing pitches. So things from like bold formatting and bullet points through to attachments, links being included, and whether tailored or generic intros have any impact on the summaries. So that led us to about 626 emails that we analysed across all of these key points. And now we're going to jump into some key findings. I'm going to pass you over to Alex.
Cool. Okay. So firstly, we looked at the AI summaries by length, just to kind of see the difference of what it picks up when you send a pitch email. Microsoft was by far the longest. It actually got to the point where once we'd press summarize in Copilot, it was almost like it was rewriting the entire pitch email. So it's very, very different to the likes of Google, which we found would usually give you 2 to 3 bullet points max. and that was enough to essentially summarize it. So I think some journalists would probably prefer the Gmail route, where it's short and sweet, but Microsoft could be good for some journalists who want to have a little bit more of a deeper dive. But it was much longer than Apple in that sense too. The majority of the summaries came from earlier in the email. I think most PRs who are sending pitches to journalists know that the start of the pitch is crucial and really important, and the summaries here matched that as well. So content that was in the start of the email was more than likely to be cited across all three. A little bit more specifically then, we looked at summary, subject line, keyword match, and keyword inclusion rates as well. I think specifically on the keyword inclusion rates, PRs have a good laugh when it comes to kind of what we want to include in our subject lines and what keywords can we put out there that is actually going to really be a news hook. And it was really interesting to understand the difference between the three platforms and whether your keyword within your subject line actually mattered when it came to an AI summary. So expert quote was something that done well on Google and Microsoft, but Microsoft, again, I think based on the fact that it was just a lot longer of an AI summary, included a lot more of the words and also matched the keyword threshold too. One thing that was very interesting is tailored intros and how they may influence AI summaries. And it was actually only Copilot that actually referenced this in its summaries. We all know, I think, again, as PRs, that if we can make our emails super tailored, whether that is just commenting on a previous study that a journalist has written so you can add to it, anything that makes your email stand out is really important. But interestingly, only Copilot was the platform that actually referenced a sentence within their summary that you could see that you put the effort into saying that we've seen a previous study, etc. Again, whether that's down to Copilot just providing a much more in-depth summary or not. It was quite interesting to see whether this would actually change in the future. Again, just like we talked about, if there's going to be more AI pitch emails and there's a way to filter that out, then one way to actually keep it in a journalist inbox is to add personality and tailoring to emails. Bullet points were the one formatting technique that really influenced things a lot. I feel like it's quite common that PRs would, in average, use bullet points. It's a really good way of quite literally summarizing what key stories are you're telling from your story, but they were really prevalent across all three. Again, one thing that we found with Google just by visually looking is a lot of the time the 2 or 3 bullet points would be almost matching the bullet points we actually put into the pitch as well. So it kind of goes to show that if you are using bullet points, and we've got an example later on to show you, that short and sweet and directly to the point is really important here, because there's a good chance that all three of these AI summaries could actually just lift that direct messaging. And if you've included that as a potential another subject line or just really clear data, that is enough to grab a journalist's attention for a story. Again, Google had the clear preference on the first bullet point here. So nearly 70% included information from the first bullet point that we would include in pitch emails. I think on average, we use about 3 or 4 bullet points within those pitches. So it just goes to show that first one is, you've really got to nail that. Interestingly, as Chloe mentioned, when we had a lot of experimenting with things we wanted to include and things we didn't want to include. And these 4 didn't appear at all, essentially, into the AI summary. So your tables, bold text graphics, and attachments. I think Chloe and I kind of knew from this that attachments may be a bit of a challenge, the same with graphics, in terms of what AI can read and what it can't. But we had good fun experimenting with bold text, highlighting an expert in bold, highlighting key statistics in bold. But interestingly, it didn't really seem to make too much of a difference. Cool. That's kind of a little bit of deeper dive into some of the nitty gritty statistics. Again, we can open to the floor if anyone's got any questions, but also, recap on some bits.
Yeah, no questions yet, but I do have a couple questions. So, I mean, with Microsoft, I feel like my overall takeaway was like a lot of this stuff seemed to work because they just had such long summaries, right? So, like, it would show up in most of the time. But so I get that. It does, though, seem, I feel like my bigger takeaway on like actionable, insight is like the bullet points is super important. And so do you have any recommendations? Like if we're talking about bullet points specifically, I've gone through versions of this where it's like, do you do 2 bullet points, 3 bullet points, 5 bullet points? Like, let's start at something very specific like that. Like, is there an optimal number of bullet points?
I don't think so. I think it very much depends on what your story is. And if you have, say, 3 stories within one campaign, bullet point per part of that story would be very good. not only does it help the journalist kind of give a really quick screenshot essentially of what your entire campaign's about, I think once you get past 3 bullet points in a pitch email, it looks really just long and fluffy. And I think, again, we've got an example later on that you also don't want those to be too long with those bullet points. I think the best way to think of it is the bullet points that you add into a pitch email are just new subject lines. That's probably a really good practice to have in your head. But if your original subject line doesn't work for the journalist in terms of like how they write, perhaps you've given them another 2 or 3 alternatives to also think about the story. So yeah, I think just from our sense and like a visual guide, we probably wouldn't go more than 3.
Yeah, I mean, and that gets back to this idea of like the actual length of or amount of information you want to be giving the journalist, right? Like, I feel like sometimes on these larger reports is maybe where you see this or you have this urge to like, I need to give them 5 bullet points because it's, this big city index study and I want to do the top 10 or whatever, but is there maybe like, is this data telling you that maybe there's room for, I don't call it like micro pitching or something, where it's like, I'm going to hone in on like the smallest angle I can, the most focused angle I can, and kind of pitch less, especially if we have platforms like Gmail that we know are taking from smaller chunks and writing smaller summaries. Yeah, what do you think? How about Chloe? What do you think about that?
So I would say that still having the detail in the email, it doesn't need to be extensive, but still having the detail means once they've read the email summary, if they're interested, they've already got a bit more context because they're getting their short, snappy summary from the AI summary potentially now, which means then they've got a bit more context. And then if you have a link through to the rest of the content, then they can go on there for even more information and research. But it kind of needs to be the step between the really short, snappy summary and the whole piece of content with all of the data. And so somewhere in the middle. It's really hard to say like exact length. I think one of the media reports actually talked about what the ideal is for different types of pitches, which was quite helpful to see, quite interesting. And I think it really does vary based on the story and how in-depth your story is anyway. But I think it's quite good to see it as a stepping stone.
Yeah. Okay, one other question I had was, and tell me if you think it makes sense for us to wait to answer this one, but this idea of like, should we be optimizing for Gmail, Microsoft, all the above? Because they seem to, there are some universal truths at this point that what you've gone through and the study. But I think there are some things that like, are better for Google or better for Microsoft. And I was doing some research to kind of see if I could find anything about the usage of like Google Workspace versus Microsoft 365 and in terms of email platforms. We don't necessarily have that. We have data on the email addresses, but that doesn't necessarily, like if you have a Gmail address, if people are sending to Gmail addresses, they're not necessarily using Gmail as their platform. It might still be Apple Mail or whatever. So unfortunately, we don't have that. But the research I found is still skews more towards Google as like the Google Workspace, like especially in B2B, like people use Google. I don't know if that's necessarily journalists, if they fall in the B2B space, but it was like 40% Google and 30% Microsoft 365 and then a mix of other stuff.
So you might
I guess
Alex,
yeah.
But I
Yeah,
think
go ahead.
based on the fact that I don't think we know specifically, especially in the journalism industry, what the split is of everyone, what everyone's using. I would say at the moment we probably need to optimize for all 3, but there are takeaways that make sense across all 3, which we'll come on to after the next section. Like the rest of the findings, we'll come on to them, and they do make sense to be able to use those to optimize for all 3 platforms. Did you have a different view, Alex?
No, I think I'm going to give a answer everyone hates, but I think it's just too early still to actually understand, the movement towards journalists using AI. Again, as you're saying, Vince, if we just knew what platform everyone was using, like journalists, the most, it would just make lives a lot easier in terms of what we then go and do. That'd be amazing.
Or harder for the journalists, yeah.
Or harder, yeah. So it's still, I think the root of it is your story needs to be good. It needs to be engaging. And if you tick those 2 boxes, the chances are that an AI summary is going to do you a good favor in actually pulling out, what your story's about. And then as Chloe said, it's about eyes on page. And in this instance, it's about eyes on your email. So if they read that summary and think, sounds quite interesting, I then have the rest of the email that I can read that basically gives me all the information about a campaign or a press release that I probably don't need to then go back to the PR and have a conversation, which takes time. So it kind of feels like we're a little bit early in terms of just which one we should optimize for. But as Chloe said, like there is definitely some similarities across all three that you can just nail the basics to give you that best chance.
Yeah, and I think it gets back to that, like you were saying, kind of, Chloe, the almost a curiosity gap, right? Like, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the first bullet point, as much as just has to be early on in the email, right? Like it seems like, and then the bullet points can be the supportive data, like the most important supportive data, like put that first, maybe second. So I know we'll get into this. I don't want to jump the gun too much, but yeah, I think that was my big kind of aha with reading some of this, is just like, and hearing you talk kind of reinforced it. It's just like, you should be, I mean, it's best practices anyway, right? It hasn't really changed, but this idea of like, you have to hook the reader right away. And you're also, if you do a good job of that, you're probably going to hook the AI in the same way, right? You're going to get the AI to kind of, use that same terminology and reflect that. So, but yeah, I'll let you keep going.
Thanks, Vince. Okay, so some extra findings from the study were that luckily including links didn't have a negative influence. Had a bit of a mixed influence. So Microsoft included the links because they had a longer summary to do so. So they mentioned them. They didn't actually include the specific content link. They usually mentioned it in phrasing such as more data is shared via a link, or more content is via the link or press release, for example. And it was only really mentioned only a handful of times on Google emails, not at all on Apple. This might change as we move forward, especially if specific phrasing is used, which makes AI think that the meaningful content is housed somewhere else. But I'm excited to see what happens there, really. But it's just quite good that it's not a negative one, and that it doesn't mean that something's impacting negatively, then our emails don't get read in the right way. So yes, so that's that one. And then...
Sorry, Chloe, I was going to jump in. This was really interesting, wasn't it, at the time? Because this was again around experts providing comments and journalists having to kind of screen whether something was real or not. And so we were really determined to see that if we put an About Us page or like a Meet the Team page, they had their own, like our expert had their own dedicated page on their website, or they had a LinkedIn profile. We wanted to put them into the pitches to actually see if it helped with credibility, because obviously then the journalist can go see this person's real, okay, I can trust them. So it's really interesting to see that it didn't actually really have too much of a difference. And again, whether that's going to be something in the future, because you really do need to prove that your expert's a person. It's as simple as that. And the best way to do that is if they've got an About Us page with a picture of them and their bio. So yeah, it's quite interesting to see that didn't really have too much of an impact.
Thanks, Alex. And then I guess the most worrying finding, I think, that we all agreed on was that AI is actually misrepresenting the original email from our study in up to a third of the summaries, which is quite big. We expected it among a handful, but not quite that percentage. So that was split across data, experts, and other information within the email. If you don't mind skipping on to the next one, Alex, thank you. Predominantly across data and experts, and it was either it was confusing data and stats, or confusing two different sources, or what the study was showing, or it was completely muddling what expert quotes were saying. Which, if you think about how short some of these summaries are, and if they are relying on these quick summaries, then that could really put you and your client or your brand in a really negative light. And I think I read a stat that was about 40%, I think it was, of journalists said that if they suspect a PR to be misrepresenting data or not giving true information, they would be likely to block them. So say it reads your email wrong in one instance, if you get blocked, that might impact coverage further down the line too. And then we've got an example of what this looks like on the next slide. Thank you. So one example being that we used one of the templates from a previous campaign, which was expert or thought leadership advice on what to do with your electric vehicle in winter because the temperature drops. And the expert advised that you should be keeping your vehicle as charged as possible, and around 40 to 80% is ideal. So essentially saying that you shouldn't let it drop below 40% absolute minimum, but you should be keeping it charged above that. Whereas the email summary pulled out that you should charge just to 40 to 80%. So it might look minor, but actually that would put your expert into question, because it doesn't sound like reliable information. And if that is one of the key points that the summary is pulling out, especially with Google, where the summary is so small, if that is one of the key points that it's pulling out and then it gets questioned, you might get ruled out straight away, and your email doesn't actually say that. So that was one of the most worrying data points. I think we were going to pause there before we go into what it means for pitch emails, in case there were any questions around data or misrepresentation.
No questions yet on the chat, but yeah, I mean, this was the part that I kind of tried to dig into the most, I feel like, when we were doing the study, because I do think this is the most eye-catching piece of this thing. But do you think that in this case, like, journalists will be relying on the AI summary for this data? Or do you think like I want to gauge, the concern level of this, but, honestly, right? Like if you see that AI says this, are you more likely then going to be like, oh, that's somewhat interesting, and I'm going to read the actual quote? Or do you think journalists would actually read this summary and just be like, that doesn't sound interesting, and then, or are they going to like lift it right from AI and put it right in their piece or something? I'm wondering if it's how concerned we should be with this, and your take on it.
So I would think that they wouldn't pull directly from an AI summary. I think they are definitely more wary about how truthful AI is in that respect. However, with the lack of time and resource, I wouldn't be surprised if they either just went past it because they were like, that doesn't sound quite right. I don't think that expert will have what I want to say or what we should be saying. And it depends how bad the misrepresentation is as to whether they spot it and think we wouldn't want to receive any more emails from that PR. I don't know how many would actually go that far based on an AI summary. Alex, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think this was always a kind of treading on water kind of thing, where how much do journalists rely on AI summaries, and how much do they not? And I think if it's specifically a data point, then I think there's going to be a case for a PR within their subject or within their email, to actually source where their data is from, make a note, put a footnote in, for example, because then again, if a journalist is thinking, okay, do I trust this? Oh, okay, I can scroll down and see that, that's where it's referenced and it's come from. That kind of alleviates any worries there. The challenge, I think, is going to be the expert comment things, because it is at that point one person saying one thing and you're hoping that a platform is actually taking what they've said word for word. And specifically when it's putting quotation marks, you'd also hope that the AI can see that that's a part that shouldn't be tampered with, like that should be taken as face value. So I think this is a stumbling block that we hope was obviously going to get better as time goes on. But I still, like Chloe says, I don't think journalists are going to only create a story just from an AI view, because I think that's a bit too risky for them at the moment.
Yeah, I would agree for sure. Do you think that there's a case to be made for writing more simple comments or quotes, or even presenting data in a way that can't be misconstrued? Right? Like when you read this, keep your vehicle as charged as possible, ideally around 40 to 80% is ideal. Like, is there maybe a push to, make it more simple where, like, if somebody were to say this back, there's no way they would get it wrong, right? Like, is that even something worth pursuing? At this point, we're, like, tailoring for AI versus people, but I wonder if there's something to this. Alex, what do you think?
It's interesting because it's almost like you're getting to the stage where you have to prove what you said is real.
Right.
And my first thought was, okay, just send the journalist a video of the spokesperson saying out loud. But even then, that could just be AI, the way that we've seen. Right? Like, you can't even trust that at this point. Yeah, it's whether, I think it depends on the topic you're talking about. If it's obviously something that's news, like has just popped in the news, very serious, and the brand thinks it's good enough to put some content on its own site to talk about, like, say, like a government change, for example, that's when you can put the same quote on your brand's website as well as email, and they can hopefully cross-reference to be like, okay, this is obviously something that he wants to speak about. So I think if you have something where it's worth create a quick page on site, that could probably help alleviate things there. I think the only other thing is, and this was something that was really big a few months ago about building brand and building experts for your for your clients is if they're featured in the news a lot, they just become a trustworthy source. And if they're cited a lot, then the chances are that if a journalist sees that that's quote is from someone who's featured in the news regularly, they will tend to just trust that from face value. So I think it goes back to, especially from an expert comment point of view, the more that they're cited, the more that they become trustworthy, and the more that you're probably going to have the thought of AI putting these together kind of ruled out of a journalist's mind because they know that they've seen them in the news.
Yeah, I love those. That makes a lot more sense than trying to tailor your emails so that AI won't screw them up. Safeguarding it from a more, holistic point of view. I think that makes a lot more sense. I wanted to call out one other thing too, before we get to the kind of final takeaways that you had brought up. I thought that was really astounding was there was a case, getting back to the links, right? We're providing links. There was a case, I think, that you pointed out where it seemed as though the AI model, I think this was Copilot, Microsoft, had visited a link and pulled information from that link that wasn't actually even in the email itself. But it only happened like 2 times or something, right?
Yeah, it was very small. I think it was about 5% of occurrences the information in the summary wasn't in the initial email, but it was within the campaign content. And we were questioning around it as well. Microsoft Copilot has built-in web search capability. So as long as it's not switched off at an organization level, it can, when it scans your email, it can go and do web searches via Bing using search queries or making assumptions that they've used the link because they've gone to the article and taken stuff from that piece. And then they can ground their response in additional information. In about 5% of occurrences, that seemed to be happening. And that's where the inquisitiveness around the wording comes in as to whether with the way we present links are making Copilot think that the meaningful content is at this place and therefore it's going to find more information from there. Maybe that will change over time and more of those occurrences will happen. But I'm quite interested to see what happens there.
Yeah, 100%. I know the other level of this that we haven't really even talked about is this idea of like personalization. So there is a piece of like AI now where, at least in Google, I believe, where you can opt into giving Gemini access to all of your email history, right? And when you do a search, it will also cross-reference that type of thing. Now, right now, this is all opt-in, but I had Garrett Sussman from iPullRank was on our podcast. He had given a great talk at SEO Week about this big test that he did where, they created some personas and like asked a bunch of questions just to see how and what, how Gemini answered these questions and whatnot. So I would think that if you are opted in, I'm wondering how much different these AI summaries would change based off of something like, email history with this one person, right? And it's, here's Chloe emailing you again about the same person that emailed about the best cities for whatever. I wonder if it gets to that level where it's like, it almost becomes a benefit to build relationships because it kind of can remind the journalist like, hey, you know who this person is kind of thing. Just kind of theorizing here, but that's where my head goes with some of this stuff and like trying to connect the dots to the future. Because I do think a lot of this is like, we don't know what we don't know yet. And this is very much a point in time with this study. And I wonder if we did this study 6 months from now, what it would look like, as these AI models progress. But yeah, certainly something interesting to think about. But let's get to your takeaways, because I think that this is, to me, is kind of the most important piece of all this is like what to do with all of this.
Yeah. Okay. So I quickly just had a really random thought again. What you've just said, Vince, is whether if you're doing an expert quote that you've worked with that journalist before and they've covered your expert, that within your new email, you should say that you have worked with X before, you've covered X before. And then your email summary says, oh, it's sent from XYZ, who you've previously cited before, builds up the trust. And yeah, could be something worth trying as well. But yeah, what does it mean for pitch emails moving forward then? I think from what we've said at the start is that just have to keep everything clear. Context is really important, I think, in this instance. We want sentences and to make sense on their own. We just want things to be very digestible, not only for the journalist's benefit, which is just helpful anyway, but we want to avoid the confusion from AI. And as Chloe said, like we've seen that misinterpretation happens a good amount of time. So we almost need to think backwards and think, okay, how can I avoid that from happening? Front load the most important information. Again, this is quite common in terms of getting your point across right at the start. What's the story about? Is it interesting? Where's the data from? It's about not hiding information. And we've seen that tables and graphics don't necessarily appear in AI views. So if you are trying to tailor for AI, then you know that there's no point including those in your pictures and you can just go straight for it with the key points. And then craft bullet points carefully. They are definitely the thing that gets cited the most. They need to make sense on their own. The first one is the one that seems like it's the most important. So either use that as your headline story, your headline fact, your headline piece of data. Maybe if you're writing an expert commentary piece, you do a bullet point that kind of shows who the journalist is. To get that point across. Who the expert is to get that point across. And also try and tailor these to each journalist as well. So we've put together an example essentially of what this could look like with a campaign that we've done recently around relaxing cities. I'm going to help plug you here, Vince, with List IQ, which is what we used on Google News to essentially just try and find stories that were similar in the space that had been written from big publications that we really wanted to get onto. And basically within 2 buttons, we can generate sheets with journalist email summary about, who they write for, job titles and things, and kind of start creating our media list from scratch from there. And then craft a pitch email. This is a snippet of one. Really important to say that each email is tailored to how a journalist writes. But the 3 kind of bullet points here you can see are our key takeaways from all of this, where you need to provide the context of what you're writing about and why it could be interesting to start with for a journalist. You want to front load your information. So already within the second paragraph, we're 3 sentences in, we're kind of telling the journalist what the story's already about. And then we also want to look at crafting bullet points. So they're quite high up already. You'll see that all 3 could easily be a subject line in itself, but they're also very readable for a journalist as well to understand, and an AI to understand as well. So you kind of get the best of both worlds in that sense. And obviously the idea is, to kind of influence our summaries in this instance. Rule number 1 for us needs to be that it cites it correctly. I think, as Chloe alluded to, if you have one AI summary that might completely change what your story's about and a journalist kind of takes that and runs with it, then there's a very good chance they may never want to cover your piece of content again. So it's really important to make sure that it's and the way that you can do this, which is really handy, is just testing on yourself, just like we did with the study. Like, send it to a couple of colleagues and make sure that their summaries are clear, concise, they're accurate. Like, we had some really good fun where Chloe and I would receive the same email and get completely different AI overviews, which is really fun to see. But we also need to make sure that they are just both factually correct in what we're saying. And you can see there that the one on the right with the 2 bullet points is Google. Apple is on the right below it. And then the size difference you can see from Copilot on the left is almost regurgitating a whole landing page for you for a journalist. So really interesting to see the difference in sizes there. Cool. And then finally, then, just a reminder across those 3 things. Again, context is really important here. We need to eliminate the capabilities for AI to get something wrong, essentially. Front load the most important information is what a journalist wants to read anyway, let alone an AI. So that's kind of a good practice to get into. And then finally, off bullet points carefully. I think a cool takeaway is a bullet point can be information, but it can also be a subject line. So have a bit of fun with playing between the 2. And there we go.
Yeah. So we didn't have any questions come through the signups. So I had prepared a handful, but one of the things I really wanted to address, Alex, I think is an underappreciated piece of this that you mentioned, this like tailoring the bullet points to the journalist, right? It's very easy to say something like that, but in practice, right? Like, what does that look like? How do you find and identify, what makes a journalist unique? What angle is going to be most interesting to them? Because I think that's kind of the crux of a lot of what we do. You can nail you can have a great story, but like if it's not tailored exactly to the way that it's going to resonate with them, it can fall flat. So if you guys can both kind of give me your thoughts on that, I feel like that's one of the keys to this for me.
Yeah, I'll actually use this. This is quite a good example. The travel space is really good for this, but what you'll actually find is a lot of the time that a journalist will just use the same format for their headline of content, like they'll write in the same way. And so I think this kind of goes back to really old school PR tactics where you're trying to create a subject line that a journalist will just copy and paste. And if they've done that, if they do that, then you've absolutely nailed it. You couldn't have done a better subject line because they've literally pinched it, which is amazing. It's kind of now evolving into the bullet point format where you're having that mix between what is something that just an AI can just take really easily, and then also can I turn this into a mini subject line? And if you've got a journalist who writes, these are the X best, for example, then a really good way is potentially playing around with that. Because if you then had a bullet point that had that format, you're now having a subject line and you're also having an AI summary that kind of are quite close to each other, but they, again, are written in the way that the journalist writes. And so you're just increasing your chances, I think, of a journalist being like, well, I write like that anyway. I can just whip out quickly and go without making too much work for the journalist. So I think that's really important, that you'll notice that there are patterns with how journalists write. And I think if you do your research, which is the most important part when it comes to creating your media list, that personalization can really go a long way.
Yeah, anything to add to that, Chloe?
Just that I think everyone in especially digital PR, maybe PR now too, know how popular indexes are. I don't think they're really going to go anywhere anytime soon. And when you do an index, a lot of the time you have multiple angles, because that's why we create them, right? So that you can increase your outreach remit and you can go as broad but relevant as possible. So you can go down a few routes to make sure you've got enough news stories to outreach over several weeks. So making sure that if you've got journalists for specific angles, you're not just focusing on the angle, but you're researching exactly what they've written about, so you can tailor it. So say you have, like, going slightly off your relaxing one, Alex, so say something like foodie, for instance. Say you had like the foodie capitals. If you were going to someone who is more regional writer, if you knew they've written more about specific cuisines or specific things, making sure that's in your bullet point, not just the focus on the region, I think that also goes a long way. So you're kind of taking into account the writer's passions and styles and exactly what they write about, rather than just a top level where they cover this region.
I'm curious, is that the kind of research you do before starting a campaign too? This is getting a little off topic, but do you like look to validate like these angles have enough people writing about this type of thing?
So I would say, and Alex, feel free to add, I would say that for the top angles and the top publications that we want to land in, we will do more research to make sure that we are validating exactly what they're writing about and what they're interested in. Alex,
even before creating the campaign, like, are you kind of validating like, yes, this audience kind of exists before you, like, if you know, okay, foodies are going to be interested in this, there's enough foodies that I could pitch them and get links or coverage. Like, do you go that far?
Yeah. Knowing that we've got the outreach scope, so knowing that we have enough places to target to increase coverage opportunities is really important. And if it doesn't come into account before the ideation, because obviously you don't want to always limit creativity. I think we've all got clients where sometimes it's a bit of a struggle and you've got into a bit of a creative slump and you're like, right, we need to do everything we can to just like break those walls down and just go as creative as possible. It definitely has to come in as part of the concepting process. So once you've got that initial idea, making sure it's strong enough, that is a key part of making sure it's strong enough before you even pitch it or propose it to your stakeholders or your client.
Yeah, okay. The other question, I guess, kind of piggybacks on this, but not really, I guess. It's this idea of like giving the journalist the story versus giving them the data to tell their own story, right? So this ties in probably more closely with the idea of like bullet points and the AI summaries. Like, we often used to struggle with this, especially for like survey results, where it's like, does a journalist want just the data? You know, it's a little different with a city index or state index because it's a little more obvious like what the takeaways are. But for something like a survey, I feel like there's a case to be made for both, where it's like, you know, here is maybe the overall, like, we did a wellness study, you know, the Wellness Trends Report 2026, versus we found in our study that, you know, whatever, 80% of people need breaks from work. Like, do you want to give them the story? Is that the way to do it? Or do you like to give them enough data that they can kind of tell their own story?
Do you want to take that, Alex?
Yeah, I would say a bit of both. I think we mainly focus story first. I think it's really interesting what you're saying about the data side of things, because I definitely feel about 4 or 5 years ago that we would always make data sets publicly available for any journalists that can go in and craft their own story. And I think it's just because they had more time. I think if they didn't like the story that you went with, but they still loved the idea and they loved the data, then we would find that journalists would write about your content, but have a completely twisted story because they've gone in there and they've used it. Whereas now I just think just doesn't happen anywhere near as frequently because of just time. I also think PRs have got a lot better at actually just giving all the information in one go. Like, we don't want a journalist to move away from our email that we in a weird way, we don't always want a conversation with a journalist because it means we maybe have missed
Right.
something, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's where leading with story first is really important, and you just have to nail your story because journalists sadly have quick turnaround times now, and they probably can't sit there and go through a survey or a 10 tab Google sheet, for example, with loads of data on, which would probably give them a really amazing story that maybe you've just not decided to lead with. But there's definitely, I think, been a shift in the importance of nailing your story first time round. And hey, if they want to go in and check the data and think of something else, then that's amazing still. But it definitely feels like there's been a shift in the past few years.
Yeah. How about you, Chloe? You feeling the same way?
Yeah, I would say so too. I think that some of the data sets are huge. And I think that they are quite complex and it does take time to work through them. And with journalists worried about how much time they've got, already finding their jobs exhausting, I think a lot of the time they do take the stories directly from us. And we try to make sure we give different angles and things so that they do have a unique story. Because I guess that's the other side. It might not be that they don't necessarily like the initial story. It might be that they need something more unique. And so we do try to twist it and to tailor it so that it's not the same every single time. Which I do think helps. I think it helps with them just being able to take it then.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't want to keep you too long. I think we're kind of coming up to time here. Is there anything that you think people should know for the future of this to kind of safeguard or kind of directionally think about when they're crafting emails? I mean, I've heard you say a handful of different things like, the story is most important, front load the information, overall the story trumps the AI kind of concerns as well, tailoring to journalists. Are there things that you think are going to become even more important as this AI stuff progresses? Alex, I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think it kind of comes down to credibility again. I think we hope that AI gets better at citing information, but I think it still comes back to your stories need to be good, like strong methodologies. If a journalist is reading it, your experts need to be proven that they're experts. I think it's all about weirdly flipping it and just minimizing the chance of something being cited wrong. I think I said it earlier, but just keep practicing on yourself. I think that's a really good tactic to kind of take forward. Have fun and experiment with a ton of different subject lines like we did and different bullet points, and send yourself 50 emails and just have a read. And you might get to a stage where you're actually finding a couple of patterns where if you were a journalist and you saw that AI view, would that make you excited about writing a story? And if it did, then, give that specific one a try. So I think as we do advance, and if we came back to this in 6 to 12 months' time, it'd be amazing to see what AI reviews are putting through, whether they're getting longer as well. Like, I think for Gmail to only give you 2 bullet points is crazy. That's so small and it didn't really change depending on how long our emails were either. I think sometimes we maybe got 3 bullet points, but that was it. So it'd be very interesting to see how that changes, and then obviously how we need to potentially adapt what we pitch to fit those. So yeah.
I love that. How about you, Chloe?
For me, it's just context. Always contextualizing everything. So every point needs to make sense on its own. I just think it's going to become even more important. So it was always super important to have the who, what, why, and why now right at the top. But if it's starting to get confusing in one sentence, I think people are going to have to start breaking stuff down into a couple of sentences, making sure that each one makes sense on its own still, but the key points then don't get muddled with how they're read. There are instances where you read something, you read it again, you're like, oh no, I'm not sure, that could be read in a different way, and you don't want it to be read in a different way. So I think it's always going to be context for the upfront, for the bullet points, for how tables are introduced, for everything. I think it's going to need to be that everything you say needs to make sense on its own, and I think that's probably the biggest thing that's going to go a long way.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, especially when you consider all the research and kind of suggestions that have come out in the SEO world of like chunking information and giving enough context. I think all that stuff goes a long way and makes sense for emails as well. So I totally agree there. I want to thank you both. This was a fascinating study. You and your team did a ton of the heavy lifting here and digging. So I want to thank you both. And I think there was one more Era member whose name I'm forgetting here that also helped.
Laura Brothers.
Laura, yeah, yes. So shout out to Laura as well. So, but yeah, Chloe, Alex, I'll share in the show notes, but definitely for everyone listening, check out everything that Era's doing. Check out the study that we have published on BuzzStream. Do you have your study published on your end as well?
We do.
Era side? Okay.
I'll share the link, Vince.
Yeah, so we'll share the links there. But if people have questions about this stuff, please feel free to follow up. I'm going to post this on the webinar section within BuzzStream. I'll probably post this within the actual study itself too, but then on social. So if you have questions about this stuff, please reach out. Like I said, List IQ, for anybody who's had signed up for this webinar, if you're interested in checking it out, please let me know. I can help give you some extra credits. But yeah, big shout out and thank you to Chloe and Alex. This was fantastic. And thank you both for taking the time out of your busy days to do this webinar for us.
Thanks for having us, Vince.
Thanks, Vince.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody else out there, and stay tuned. I'll be following up with this recording for you all. All right. Good luck out there.